First time I saw the Korabra series was when Gavin had an exhibition about the work, the series of paintings, and I'm just trying to remember if I first saw them at the Edward Tota Gallery in London. But I do remember seeing them before they were shown at The Other Story, and I saw them in their entirety, the whole series, in one go. My impression of the paintings were that they were, one, quite enormous, quite big. They felt very weighty, and of course the kind of narrative within the work seemed extremely important at that particular moment in the mid-1980s. There's also this narrative about the relationship between Africa and modernism that was evident at the time and seemed also really quite radical to be making that kind of statement in the paintings. So I remember being incredibly impressed actually by the scale, but also by the very subject matter of the work. This is the first time that I've seen them in actual since The Other Story, and it's really strange seeing them in actual. They are nothing like how they reproduce in the publication. I hadn't really anticipated how physical and how the way in which they're painted. They are very, very painterly. So that's really quite a surprise, because when one sees them reproduced in publications, one looks at the image, but when standing in front of them, I'm very aware of the way that they've been made, the scale of their presence as paintings. In the context of The Other Story, I think to a certain extent these paintings were a kind of physical embodiment of what that exhibition was trying to talk about, which was the relationship between a kind of African diasporic history and modernism. Not only modernism in painting, but modernism or modernity itself. My perceptions of the paintings have changed in recent times in kind of returning to them in relation to thinking about how the work speaks to a kind of romantic tradition, particularly a German romanticism. I hadn't been aware at the time of first seeing the works, or even when I saw them in The Other Story, Gavin's journey to Germany and the influence of whether it's Joseph Boyce, or seeing the relationship between what Gavin was doing in these paintings and the work of Kiefer. That narrative hadn't really been apparent in my first encounters with the work. Now trying to study the work, seeing another narrative unfold, which is really, really interesting, because it's quite complex. In some ways it could be seen as problematic, a whole relationship to expressionism which hadn't really kind of occurred in my first encounters with the work. I think it is a conversation. I wonder whether it's a conversation that's trying to problematize a set of pre-existing conversations around the relationship between expressionism, the idea of having a kind of fatherland, the idea of a kind of mythical place, which of course is a relationship with Joseph Boyce as well as with Kiefer, or the question of actually about origins. There is a dialogue here about the kind of transatlantic triangle between Africa and Europe and the Americas, and the way in which African art, which at a certain point within art history was considered primitive and was then used by the expressionists. It feels to me that all of these complicated dialogues are going on in the work. Conversation sounds a kind of friendly term. Dialogue, I think, might be able to tease out some of the really awkward relationships. So, to think about Picasso and his first Cubist painting, which relies on African sculpture as a way of seeing a new way of creating a form. But how that relationship to Africa and the so-called primitive is a cornerstone of modernism, a cornerstone of the kind of modernist trajectory that has kind of unfolded. I think there's a critique there. So I'm not sure I would call it necessarily a conversation, but definitely a dialogue which tries to raise quite complicated questions. I've been reading some of the text of Hal Foster in his book Recodings, and there's an essay in there which talks about, in a way, he's quite dismissive of neo-expressionism, which of course these works are part of that field of practice. And in that essay, he talks about how this idea of the expressive and boundless artist, actually through having gone through expressionism and abstract expressionism, how by the 1980s one can no longer talk about this kind of practice as expressive, but he calls it a kind of formula, that there's a kind of repertoire that these artists are re-rehearsing. I think he's probably much more dismissive about it than I would be, but I'm able to see in these paintings how there is a certain kind of repertoire that is almost planned. So the use of using a knife in which to lay the paint on very thickly is quite systematic, or the idea of painting where there's a kind of drip. It's almost uniformly across the painted surface, and it's quite evident for me seeing that here, that beyond the question of the image, the actual way in which the work has been, the material has been applied, has a certain kind of choreography about it. It's a staging of a certain kind of formalist gesture. It is a staging of a knowing about the kind of effect that working with the materials in this way will have. So to a certain extent, one has to then ask, what is it that the painter or the artist is asking of us, or trying to make us then engage with by re-rehearsing this kind of, as I say, repertoire. I think that the imagined audience is a knowing audience. So I think the question about the signs and the images and the references, I think that the painting is asking us to recognise the various signposts in the works, whether that is the way it's painted, whether that's the imagery, whether that's the narrative of a historical painting, of history painting itself. Although, of course, the essay by Foster happened after these paintings were made, the debate about, whether one was thinking about Kiefer or a wider range of neo-expressionist painters, because that Kiefer's work was so much about dealing with the Holocaust, dealing with German history, dealing with the question of painting itself and history painting. I think that these works know that discourse and that Jantjes is entering into that debate, but from another perspective, which problematizes expressionism and its history, and one could almost talk about where things may have originally come from. Of the images, for me, there is a sense in which we're entering a theatre. There's a sense of being in a stage, but being almost drawn into the centre of that stage. I think this is a kind of recurring motif in this series of works. Where the horizon line, if there's a horizon line, but also where, as viewers, we're positioned really in a peculiar perspective in relation to the works. So this work that's kind of behind me, this sense of being caught up in the turmoil of the motif of the Atlantic Sea. The way in which the gesture of the paint draws us to. So that it's almost like we have vertigo in relation to the work through the use of the gesture of paint. That the figure, us as the figure in front of it, where we are become part of it, and I think that this is another aspect of the dialogue that Jantjes is wanting us to engage with. One of the reasons why I'm particularly interested in this series of works is because the works try to restage the question about the past and the present, whether it's the narrative about a kind of transatlantic trauma, or whether it's about the question of how we've arrived at painting in this way. And I would really love to see the way in which these paintings are contextualised within the museum to talk about those kinds of questions, and not just a question about Gavin Jantjes coming from South Africa, being a painter who did these works in Coventry. I think Coventry is a very important aspect of this question about trauma and reconciliation of the past. But I think the narrative around these works need to be broadened out into how these questions are discussed through art practice of the late 20th century, how they're connected to other kinds of practices. I think of Leon Golub, might be another example of talking about late 20th century modernity. For me, these works are trying to reconcile that past within that particular present.